Good evening. Bracha v'hatzlacha, zachusa yogein oleinu. Tonight is Monday night, Bais Shvat, and it is the yortzeit of Reb Zusha Meyanapol. Noteworthy to say that the Balatanya did not want to print the Tanya because he felt there was a tremendous responsibility to take on his shoulders to print such a holy book, and only with the specific haskamas of Rav Zusha Meyanapol and Rabbi Yehuda Leib HaKoyen did he say he would do it. And they traveled very far to get both haskamas. And if you open up a Tanya, you will see at the very beginning copies of the letters of authorization and haskamas of both. Now, from all of the 80-some beautiful tzaddikim, gemurim, Reb Levi Yitzchak Barditchev, and all of that the Mizritcha Maggid had, it's interesting to note that when he was nifter in 1772, that he's buried in the city of Anapol, the Mizritcha Maggid, their Rebbe, and who were the two Hasidim and Talmidim who were zoichet to be buried right next to him, one to his right and one to his left. Rabbi Yehuda Leib HaKoyen and Rav Zusha Meyanapol, the very two that the Balatanya said that without their haskama, he doesn't want to print and put out for the public the Sefer Tanya. It is too much responsibility for his own shoulders. And it was those two who gave the haskama, the approbation, and ended up being buried next to the Mizritcha Maggid, Zechusam, Yogein, Aleinu, and tonight is his yortzeit. I did mention to you that on Wednesday night, Thursday, Daled, Shvat, is the yortzeit of Rav Moshe Leib Sasaver. Also from that same chevra, the same group of tzaddikim gemurim. Now, we know that in last week's Sedra Va'era, there were 7 makos. And this week there are 3. Arba, Choshech, and Makas Bechoros. Arba, locusts, and Choshech, and then Makas Bechoros. And these 3 propelled the situation in Mitzrayim that we begin next week, Sedra, Vayehi B'Shalach Paro Es Ha'om, that it brought to a conclusion, and Paro was going to send out. We know that Lamake Mitzrayim Bivchoreim, that after the Choshech, the darkness, there was a tremendous fight in Mitzrayim from Mitzrayim to Mitzrayim. It wasn't against the Yidden. They went to Paro and there was a civil war. And that's what we say every Shabbos in Hodu, Lamake Mitzrayim Bivchoreim, because the firstborns came in and said, listen, we're all dying out. What are you waiting for? And they began fighting. There was a terrible civil war going on in Mitzrayim. So the point being that the 7, as I told you, were the Zeranpin from Chesed through Malchus, but this week was Chabad, Chochma, Bina, and Das, which are the top, because it's their power that flows down through Malchus, the last one, into this world. So it was the completion of the 10 Makkahs, which, by the way, served, in other words, we think of Mitzrayim and how mercilessly Yidden were treated, and they killed all the children and everything that was done. But it says that because Mitzrayim served as the silver platter, the plateau, to make the Kiddush Hashem, in other words, the whole world saw what was going on. That all the water suddenly turned to blood, and a Jew drinking out of a cup, his straw was bringing out pure, fresh water. But if one of the Egyptians, the Mitzrayim, put a straw into that same cup, it came out blood. The Medrash says that that's what was going on. So there was a platform for Kiddush Hashem, because the people weren't stupid. They saw what was going on. Who was doing this? It was only HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So to bring out the power of Geula, the 10 Midos, the Spheros, all had to be present. That was the spiritual foundation for the Geula. And once they finished with the 10th, there was a tremendous Kiddush Hashem, what Hashem was doing, and the platform was from Mitzrayim. And then the Geula was ushered in. And that's why many tzaddikim said that with the power of the Zohar and the Tanya and other mystical or Chasidus, because Chasidus is really not Kabbalah. It touches and references a lot of format, which is from Kabbalah. But the Zohar HaKodesh is pure Kabbalah. And it was the completion of the 10 Makkahs, which was able to cement the formation and the foundation for Geula, and it was so strong that even though the Gemara says when Mashiach will come, that will be a bigger demonstration for the world, ushering in the Geula Shlema than even Mitzrayim, but Mitzrayim will always be remembered. Because without Mitzrayim, there never would have been a Geula Shlema. There had to be the premise and the foundation, the shoirish of Geula in Mitzrayim to be planted there and to be strong like cement to be able to project the Geula Asida, the future Geula. Now, the Sfas Emet, and by the way, the first of these last three was Arba, was locusts. The Sephorna says, and he held, that locusts were crocodiles. Crocodiles. But the world does not agree with him. And they held it was just regular locusts. But by locusts, there's Lashonis that no other of the Makos does it say. For instance, if you look at the very beginning in the first few psukim of our Sedra this week, Bo, it says by V'chisa anan, V'chisa as ein ha'oretz, and it will be plentiful, and there will be so much locusts, miyom asher lo ra'u avosecha, that your forefathers, you Mitzrayim, you never saw. They never saw such an abundance of locusts. Va'avos avasecha, not only your fathers, but your grandfathers never saw such an abundance. Miyom heyosam al ha'adama ad hayom hazeh. So there was no other Makkah that we said such a thing, that your forefathers never saw and never experienced such locusts. And the promise was lo nishar ad echad, that after they took away the locusts, there was a promise that never again in Mitzrayim will you see a locust. And it doesn't say that either. So says the Sfas Emes an interesting point, that we know in Balak, the Zohar HaKadosh says in Parshas Balak, I heard a Rebbe speaking and he quoted this and he said it was in Pinchas, but it's not. It's in Balak. That at the time when there is a simcha in a family, HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his Shechina come and he invites, he goes in to the innermost sanctum of Gan Eden and he pulls out the neshamas of the parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, 3 generations, to come with him and the Shechina to the chuppah to see the simcha and to be there spiritually and see everything going on and have the nachas from the new couple, the new shalshelas in Klal Yisrael. Now, the question really is, why? And the Sfas Emes says it comes from our Sedra. That the reason is because since it says that to the Mitzrayim, that your parents in their lives and your grandparents, they never saw such an abundance of locusts, of arba. And says the Sfas Emes, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did tchias hamesim for the parents of the Mitzrayim and their parents, the grandparents, to come down and to spiritually see what was going on with the arba, because it says that they never saw it ad hayom hazeh until this day. But what do you mean until this day? But this day they did see it, says the Sfas Emes. So they actually were brought down to witness the terror of the locust, what was going on in Mitzrayim. And if it was for bad, says the Zohar in Parshas Balak, then for good it certainly is, because the Midah Toiva is much more than the Midah Ra. So if it happens in the bad, then it happens double-fold and triple-fold in the good side. And that's why the parents, if they had to come down, the Mitzrayim's parents and grandparents, to see the locust, then by the Yidden, their parents and grandparents have to see the good. And there's nothing bigger and more of a dimension of influence and pervasive, strong flowing of the flow and the current in the good than by a chasna. Because a chasna brings out the asidus. That means, how did Klal Yisrael survive and exist? Because there were doros, there were generations. And they wanted to wipe us out, and they wanted to kill us, but we still remained a people full of the dimension of generations and influence from generation to generation. So very interestingly, the Sfas Emes says they were brought back like Trias HaMesim, and they were there to see what was going on with the locusts. Now, and it's the Rabbeinu Hananel who says, the famous Rabbeinu Hananel, who says that there was never again in Mitzrayim, and he brings rayas from Medrashim and from other proofs to support and marshals support to his opinion that they never again in Mitzrayim saw, till this day, a locust in Mitzrayim. And why was that? Why were they zoicha to such a thing? What I just said to you, because they were unwilling participants in producing a Kiddush Hashem. I mean, Sof Kol Sof, the whole world was looking what's going on in Mitzrayim. And was there a bigger Kiddush Hashem than that? Seeing what HaKadosh Baruch Hu was doing, Lamala Min HaTeva, to the whole Mitzrayim. So they were not happy with it, and they were unwilling, but they were still participants because it happened on their land and to them as a people, all Eser Makos. So, and that's why, since they were producing such a Kiddush Hashem for the world, says the Rabbeinu Hananel, so they were zoicha that there was never a locust again in Mitzrayim. Now, we know that when it came to the point that they had to put the blood on their doorposts, they were told, Al Yetze Ish Mi Pesach Beso Ad Boker. That means the Yidden had to go into their houses, slam the door, and they were not allowed to go out and step out of their house, even for a minute from their house. Now, the Sfarim talk about the fact that there were three that were told not to look back. Lot, he and his wife and his small group, the girls who believed, the husbands were laughing at the story. They thought it was a big joke. The pasuk says, "Vayehi kimetzachek be'enei chasonav." They thought it was one big joke, but the girls didn't. And you see that the girls remained because they ended up in that cave with Lot later on. So they were given that tzivui that they're not allowed to look back. And when Lot's wife looked back, Vatehi Nitziv Melech. She wasn't allowed to look back, and she did, and she remained a pillar of salt. Now, also we find that Noach was not allowed to look back at what was happening. Now, there's two explanations what tzohar means, window. Was it an Even Tova, which means, let's say, a diamond that produced light for them, the shine? Or does it mean an actual window? But according to the one that says it was an actual diamond, that was because they were not allowed to look out and see what was happening to the world. It means there was water all around them. They saw the bodies and everything was all around them, the teva. and they were not allowed to see it. And the Medrash says that the third was the group of Yidden in Mitzrayim. They were not allowed to see what was going on by Makas Bechoros. They were not allowed to see the Mitzrayim and the catastrophe that was taking place with all of the firstborn. Why? Because when there's din in the world, there's severity, there's judgment. If a person looks at the judgment and he himself doesn't have such clean hands, that means maybe he himself deserves to be destroyed also. He is destroyed if he sees it. And therefore, Lot was no tzaddik omer. He was once a tzaddik omer, the Medrash says, that before Avram Avinu went down to Mitzrayim for those 90 days, and then he returned, when he went down, Lot was a tzaddik omer. The Medrash says, that's the Lashon. But after he was in Mitzrayim, like I've said to you, that he enjoyed the pleasures and the participation and activity of the 42nd Street activity of Mitzrayim, he became a Rosh Gomer. And that the Medrash says, he went from Tzaddik Gomer to Rosh Gomer. He went back, and that was the real reason Rashi says that he chose to go to Sodom, because they had a plentiful of immorality. That when the pasuk says we wanted it because it was fertile, the grass and the irrigation and everything, that was a cover-up. That's what he said. But look at Rashi. But Rashi says his real intention was all of the activity of Sodom, and he couldn't get more of it than in Sodom. So the Kadmonim ask a question. The Seder night is a reaction, a reliving of what happened in Mitzrayim. We should do exactly what happened in Mitzrayim. We drink 4 kosos because there were 4 levels of V'hotzesi, v'yitzalti, and each one had a different dimension. So to commemorate, we do the 4 kosos. And everything, we eat the maror, we eat the matzah, this is all a commemoration, a repeat, a replay of what happened in Mitzrayim. So the Kadmonim asked the following question. If that's the case, why by the Kosel Elio or by Shafot Chamascha do we open the door? It says in the pasuk, Al Yetze Ish Mi Pesach Beiso Ad Boker, that we didn't look outside because really, Halolo of the Avodah Zarah, Halolo of the Avodah Zarah. If they would have seen all the Egyptians dying, that was Midas Hadin. And if the Israelis didn't have, the Yidden didn't have clean hands, then they should have died at the same time. But they were told not to look out. And if they didn't see it, it couldn't affect them, the Midas Hadin. So when we come to the Kosher Leilio, which is the 5th kos, Vehevesi, which means Geula Shlema, by the Geula, all Yidden, whether they're good or bad, are going to be forgiven. And there are different opinions how many Yidden will be saved. Many tzaddikim said, Lo yidach mimenu nidach, that every Yid will be saved by the Geula Shlema. But some said, like the Arizal, not everyone will have Tchiyas HaMesim. So we will hope that the opinion of everyone prevails when Mashiach comes. But that's the reason why we have no problem opening the door, contrary to what happened in Mitzrayim. Because in Mitzrayim, they were all guilty and they could have paid a price for opening that door and going outside and seeing what's going on. And it could have then struck them and effectuated the Midas Hadin in them. But they were told to stay in. But we, by our Seder, are celebrating not only what happened, but the fact that the roots of Geula are in the process of happening. And by our reenactment of everything in Mitzrayim, we're laying the seeds and paving the way to be able to go out. And that's why when we come to Ve'evesi, we open the door and we're not afraid of any negativity or Midas Hadin affecting us. Now, we know in this Sedra that it says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Shemos and again in our Sedra told the Yidden to borrow from the Mitzrayim, Klei Kesef, Klei Zohav, and they had every right to take it. Even though they said borrow, they had no intention of returning it. They worked for 210 years, and they were entitled to wages, say the Meforshim. So there was nothing that was done which was improper or irregular or out of order. But there's a difference in the Lashon. Both talk about the gold and silver, Parsha Shemos, and our Parsha. But by our Parsha, it says that they should borrow it, may Esrei Ehu, from his friend, from their friend, referring to the Mitzrayim. Go take the gold and the silver out of which during the days of our parsha, Choshech, in the darkness, that's when they did it. But why the change of the Lashon? And the Chidushi Arim talks about it, and it says, Daber no, that Hashem said to Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm pleading with you to ask the Yidden to go take the silver and the gold. Daber no, like a Lashon of Bakosha, a humble request. Why? Did you ever find someone, if I said to any of you, there's a bank, you won the contest and the bank is opening the vault, go take whatever you want. Would I have to say to you, I'm begging you, I'm pleading with you, Daber no, to go take the $100 bills? You won the contest, it's legal, it's mutter. But says the Chidushi Arim that Yidden never ever dealt with money. That means when they later went out of Mitzrayim, yeah, they had 90 donkeys that were laden with jewels and gold, and they were as rich could be. But now when they were being told, go take gold and silver, they knew and they were aware of the pitfalls of having money. See, everybody says, oh, if I win the $100 million, I'm going into the 10 groceries in my area, and I'm going to wipe out the bill of every ani in my community, that there should be no, but when they win the 100 million, it doesn't always happen. And you find many people with 100 million, and they'd rather invest it but when it comes to tzedakah or things, the Yetzer Hara is not just going to let them go do that schus. The only mitzvah that says Tatzel Mimoves and Mevi Geula is tzedakah. It doesn't say such a lashon by Shabbos, Shmira Shabbos, or by Tefillin, or by anything else. That tzedakah has inherent, and if a person really believes it, it could be that he was going across a street and a car, lo aleinu, lo aleichem, 1,000 times should have hit him. But that day he gave some money, enough money to buy food for his family, and that wiped out the gezerah. He walked across the street and the car missed him and nothing happened. We don't know the cheshbonis lamala. So said the Chidushei Arim that the Yidden realized having money was a very big test. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to them, I'm pleading with you. You really don't want the money. You don't want to be tested. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe Rabbeinu, you begged them to take the money because they're entitled to it. And they're supposed to have it. And it's theirs for the hard slave labor that they performed all of the years. Now, the question is, why in Shemos it just says that they should go take from the Mitzrayim, the gold and silver. And in our Seder it says, go take from their friendly neighbor, Re'ehu, their friends. What happened suddenly? The Mitzrayim became their friends? And the answer is, as the Medrash says, that in our Parsha, the Makkah of Choshech, there was 3 days of darkness, and the darkness was like cement. It wasn't darkness that we turn off the lights and we can still move and we can't see maybe what's going on if it's pitch black. But it doesn't limit our movement. In other words, if we want to go in the dark to get into the next room, we can walk. But the Mitzrayim could not move. It was v'yomesh choshech. It was thick darkness. So if someone, when the darkness came, a Mitzri was sitting at his table, he couldn't for 3 days move from that table. If he was in bed, he couldn't get out of bed. They had to remain where they were. So the Medrash asks, so how did they eat? What, they couldn't go for 3 days with no water and with nothing? The Yidden that didn't have any darkness while it was dark for the Mitzrayim came into their houses and fed them and gave them water after being tortured and treated the way they were treated by these Mitzrayim. The darkness could have cost them their life. But the Jews, the Yidden, came in and they fed them and gave them to drink, and they realized it. They realized it. So after the Makkah of Choshech, it became Re'ehu, their friend, because they realized that as mean as they were to them, the Yidden were not that mean to them, and they saved their lives. And that's why it says Re'ehu. Now, if you'll take a look in the Pasuk, finally, when Moshe and Aaron came back to Paro and he was getting it over the head with the locusts, he said to Moshe and Aaron, okay, go out and serve your God. You want to go for 3 days. I mean, we know that they were not going for 3 days. They went out and goodbye. But when they told them, Paro asked them, who do you want to go? Mi v'mi haholchem. Who's going? So Paro first said, they answer, we're going out with the elderly, with the children, with the people. And Paro said, but you just said that you wanted to go with the people, with the adults. And there's a whole discussion in the Meforshim. What did he mean? Why did he assume that they only wanted to go out with the adults and not with the children, and not with the elderly. So they explained that Paro held in religion the only ones that can really perform and be religious are adults. Children don't understand it. Elderly are too frail and everything else. That's what the Mefarshim say. So he was forcing the issue that it should be only the adults, not the children and not the elderly. But I think it's the Sfas Emes who says that Paro understood that a people cannot thrive and exist. They cannot exist without properly bringing up the children, because then there'll be no one to talk to. That means if children are not motivated and cultivated and instilled and imparted and implanted into them the frame of mind of how to live their lives, then nothing will come. It'll wither away when they finally become adults. So by Paro, it wasn't just that he wanted the adults. He wanted that if they ended up leaving, that they should be wiped out at some point, because they did not cultivate and motivate and bring up the children, the new generation, properly. And you see that that's what happened in America. Most people who came over from Europe were Shomer Shabbos. And then look at what the East Side looked like in 1910, in 1905, in 1898. Suddenly the beards, the payas, things were disappearing. And then you saw no one is judging them, because they got over, they didn't have a piece of bread. There was no welfare, there was no bread lines, none of this. And if they didn't work Shabbos, they had no parnasa. But there were Yidden who were moiser nefesh. They worked the week, and they knew that if they didn't show up Shabbos, that Monday morning they would be told goodbye. And they did it every week. And there were some people that for 2 years and 3 years were working 1 week here and then 1 week there and then 1 week here and 1 week there. And this went on only in the name of keeping Shabbos. So it was a tremendous nisayon, and we're not judging anyone. But the youth ended up paying the price more than the people. And that's why, for instance, Shomer Shabbos, which was founded like 110 years ago, they were called Shomer Shabbos because they had a rule: if you wanted to be a member, you couldn't go to work on Shabbos. And they had a meager minyan, because most people came to daven in those days, and afterwards they put on their work clothes and they went out to work. So the children were very important to Paro, that they stay. And what about the elderly? Why did he make an issue for the youth and for the elderly? Because when we go in and see how a Zayda and a Baba live, that is the backbone and the cementing factor of the actual life of each and every Jewish family. That when we have a Baba or a Zayda sitting at the Seder or at the Shabbos table, or in the Sukkah, or in Shul, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, they set the pace for teaching the next generation with a living example of what Yiddishkeit and life is all about. So Paro wanted to wipe it out. If you have no Zakanim to emulate and to learn from, and you have no children in the Seviva going out with you to be religious out in the Midbar, you have no hope for your religion. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu said, bin arenu vizkenenu leilech. Oh no, we're not leaving over any youth or any elderly person. They will remain with us when we leave, and that's how we are leaving, without any question. Now, the second pasuk in our Seder says, Ulama'an tisaper bi'oznei vincha. That why am I doing all of these miracles? Hashem said to Moshe Rabbeinu, in order that each and every person will be able to tell Ulama'an tisaper bi'oznei vincha, that to tell over to their children, bi'oznei vincha uven bincha, and to their grandchildren, Eis asher hisalalti b'Mitzrayim. What does this word, hisalalti, mean? That which I jested, which I made fun of in Mitzrayim. In other words, I didn't just bring makos, but I did it that should put them on their hands and knees, to beg to get rid of it, to suffer through it. I mean, I didn't just do a trick I really let them have it. So the question asked by Kadmonim is, we have a rule, binfol oyevecha al tismach, that when your enemy falls, many people are very happy, but we're not supposed to be. That if you have someone who was your foe or your enemy during your lifetime, you're not supposed to rejoice when they really get destroyed or they fall and trip and lose all their money or whatever it is. You're not supposed to be happy. So why over here HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that the Mitzrayim, they were so bad. So I want your children and your grandchildren to know that the reason that I did what I did was I made fun of them in Mitzrayim, and we're not supposed to make fun of our enemy and jest. But the Chazal answer that there are two exceptions by Binfolo Yevecha, by rishis, wickedness. That means if somebody is an enemy, but there's levels of enemy, that means it could be you had an argument, you could have, he's not your friend anymore. But if he's your next door neighbor, and you find out after 10 years that the crop in your farm that you were planting the seeds, sweating with blood and tears to get the crop, and that during the night he was coming and poisoning the thing, then he's a Russia Marusha, not just an enemy. And if it's a real Russia Marusha, you're allowed to have the satisfaction when you see his downfall. And other Meforshim say that if the person is mocking you, in other words, not like you just had a difference of opinion and he stood firm with his opinion and wanted to enforce what he feels is right, but there's a commodity, there is a level, a measure of trying to dehumanize the other person, not just difference of opinion, not just trying to outdo him in their competition in business or whatever, but trying to undermine and to put down their humanity, their dignity. Then when the person does trip, you can have a level of satisfaction. So that's the reason that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, I want you to tell the children and the grandchildren how I made fun. I mocked. I jested with Mitzrayim. I didn't just destroy them. I made them go through everything and anything because they were emissary shoyim. They took babies and were throwing it into the water, a crying newborn baby. They were putting it when they were missing a brick into the cement in the wall. So because of that, it was Eis Asher Hisalalti, which I jested and which I brought out something which was not only punishment, but it was a total put down as a human being and as a person. Now we know that in this parsha, and even Rashi, the first Rashi in Chumash, Bereshis, asks, why did the Torah begin with HaChodesh Hazel Lochem, which is, in our parsha, the first mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh. You know that Rosh Chodesh is a very big inyan because if we don't know which is the first day of the month, we don't know when to have Yom Tov. That means if the Torah said, keep Pesach and eat matzah and do what you have to do on Pesach, it told you to do it on the 15th day of the month. Now, if you don't know the first day of the month, that it's Rosh Chodesh, how can you count the 15 days? Is it the day before or the day after? So that's called Kiddush HaChodesh. And in the olden times, two witnesses used to come to Bezdin and say that they saw the new moon, because in the second half of the month, it becomes pitch black. You don't see the moon at all. And then suddenly you see the moon. And of course, the Mefarshim say that's for a Yid, a lesson in life, that it can become very dark, but it always comes back to light. We have to hold out with our emunah and with our bitachon, and then we can pull through the day and come to experience the next day with a smile, with emunah, with simcha. And it's Rosh Chodesh. That's the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. And it's a backbone of Klal. So you find even in Hanukkah, they wanted to wipe out Mila, which is Tahara and Kedushas Yisrael, which makes us different than all of the nations of the world, represented by the Mila. And not to keep Shabbos, which is also a staple, a backbone of Klal Yisrael. But the third thing was Rosh Chodesh, because Rosh Chodesh represents the cycle of how a Yid lives up and down and how he rejoices with the upcoming Yom Tov. So they wanted to eradicate that when they weren't out in Hanukkah to destroy the Yidden. They were out to just get them to completely give up Yiddishkeit and become like the Goyim, adopt their culture and their existence. Now, the Rosh Chodesh is especially Yom Tov for women. That means if a man wants on Rosh Chodesh to iron or to sew, no problem. You're allowed to do it on Rosh Chodesh, but a woman is not supposed to. There are things that women do not, they can get in the car, they can talk on a telephone, but there are certain things that they don't do. Why? Because when the Mishkan was being built and the Yidden were working in Mitzrayim, before the Mishkan, when they were still in servitude, they stopped. They divorced their wives. They didn't want to have children. They said, what are we having children for? To bring them in to be out beaten on and work for the Mitzrayim and the bleeding and the striking and everything that they're living through, what do we have to bring in a generation to suffer like this? But the women went and put on makeup, Rashi says, by the kier, the mirrors. They wanted their mirrors that they looked in to be able to beautify themselves with makeup and things. And they went down to the husbands and they brought the husbands something to eat or to be there. And they were so beautiful with the makeup and everything that it brought out the desire of the men to remarry and to be with them and to be intimate and to bring the next generation. And Moshe Rabbeinu said, I don't want these mirrors to be used in the kier and the kano to beautify. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Chavivin olai. They're to me the most precious and wonderful item of everything, because the continuity and the continuation of Yidden through the generations of having children and having that were because of the women. And it came from those mirrors that they beautified themselves. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, you don't want to accept it? Kabel, chavivin olai. They're more desirous for me and anachas ruach for me, because they are given the gift of continuity and continuation of generations, and that's what Rosh Chodesh is. So the gift, the Medrash says, the gift HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to the women was the gift of Rosh Chodesh. Certain things that they don't do in celebration of the gift given to them by HaKadosh Baruch Hu and for posterity, for eternity. Now, we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Bachatzos, at midnight I'm taking out Klal Yisrael. But when Moshe Rabbeinu went and repeated it, he said, Kachatzos, around midnight. He didn't say Bachatzos, he said Kachatzos. So the Medrash says that Moshe Rabbeinu was worried that if he said Bachatzos, then if somebody had a watch and was off 30 seconds, that the cynics would come to Moshe Rabbeinu and say, wait a second, you said at midnight, Bachatzos. Bachatzos, it's not midnight, it's 30 seconds before. The problem was their watch, or whatever they were telling time by. Not Moshe Rabbeinu, what he said, but they were cynics. So for cynics, he changed and said kachatzos, around. So if his watch was off 30 or 40 seconds, he couldn't come and say, oh, you said at midnight, and it's not exactly midnight, because he said around midnight. So you would say, who cares about the cynics? Hashem said, bachatzos. So the answer is that here in Olam Hazeh, we do have to worry about the cynics. That means when we come into shul and the Rav gets done giving a beautiful drasha that he said for 20 minutes, and one wise guy in the back of shul gets up and makes a crack that everyone breaks out into laughter and just dissolved the impact of that speech and that magnificently weaved treasure and display of a drasha, in 2 seconds it's out the window. Guy made one crack and had everybody laugh, and that was it dissolved the enthusiasm and the impact. So you see that Moshe Rabbeinu had concern about these cynics. And we also have to have an open mind to include. You can't just say, oh, who cares about a guy making fun? I'll do my thing. You have to try to weave into the totality of the result something which could cushion even the less interested and the cynic of the generation. Now, I want to say to you a vort from the Brisker Rov, because it says, V'hoya hadam, by the Korban Pesach. In our Sedri, we have about the Korban Pesach. And the Korban Pesach is just one of two mitzvahs say that you're chayav koros if you don't do it. That means if a person doesn't put on tefillin, it's an aveira. He's supposed to do it, and he'll have a punishment for it, whatever. But if a person doesn't circumcise his son and doesn't bring the Korban Pesach, those two, there's a chiyuv koros. Not like the other mitzvahs that if we don't do it, we're punished. But it's not koros. Koros is a much, much more severe thing. So, says the Brisker Rov, we know the halacha, when a person brought a korban and he shechted the animal and he brought the dam on the mizbeach, once the blood was brought on the mizbeach, the korban became chulin. It wasn't kodesh, hegdish anymore. It wasn't hegdish. Except, the one exception is the Korban Pesach. That even after you bring the blood of the Korban on the Mizbeach, it remains kodesh, hegdish. Says the Brisker Rov, why the difference? All other korbanos become chulin, but not the Korban Pesach. Because the source of the blood of the Korban Pesach is what we put on the doorpost of each and every home. And when it's involving families who grow up in a home and are influenced by everything inside that home, it has to be Kodesh Kadoshim. It can't be any less. And the final vort that I want to tell you is from my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. He asked the following question. We know in this Sedra that because the firstborns all died, that firstborns have special status in Yiddishkeit. A Bechor has to have a Pidyon Haben. The Bechor of an animal, if it's the firstborn that came out, so it's holy and it has to be brought as a korban, and if not, then va'arafto, you have to kill it. But all of these bechors, whether it's a human being or an animal or whatever, you can't, it's kodesh from the time it's born, it's holy, and until you're poida it, you redeem it like a pidyon haben, you can't use it for any chulin. But after you're poida it, then you could use it to add. You can't go up to someone who didn't have a pidyon haben and say, could you please pour me a cup of water? You're not allowed to use a kohen. And if you know someone never had a pidyon haben, you're not allowed to ask him to open the door for you. He's kodesh. He can't be of service to you. And even the service, there's a mitzvah of v'kidashto. So if you pour for a kohen a cup of water, you have a mitzvah saseh d'oraisa of v'kidashto. So if someone is a kohen and he's working in the suit store, technically he's not allowed to measure your pants and for the alterations, because he's not allowed to service you, because he's kodesh. And you're supposed to be mechabed him, v'kidashto, a mitzvah aseh d'oraisa. So the Rosh Yeshiva asked the following question. If a person is holy and he's a bechor, and then we make a pidyon haben, so now he becomes chulin, what do we make all the brachos? What's the big simcha? We make a bracha al pidyon haben, shechiyanu. He's going from holy to mundane, from hegdish to chulin. What are we so happy about? So the Rosh Yeshiva answered, which in Chassidish Sforim is replete, and Chabad is like the cementing factor of Chabad, of Chochmah, Bina, and Das, that the whole reason that a person comes down to this world is to take, not to remain a malach, not to remain kadosh, but to delve into the chulin and to uplift it back to kedusha. When you take the piece of meat because you want to eat and enjoy, let's say, a good steak, you make the bracha before you eat it. And you make the bracha achrona, you've elevated every neshama inside of that food. And neshamas are in the food. And if a person, and that's why we say shir amalos before benching, because if a person didn't say a dvar Torah in the meal, then many of the neshamas remain there, they don't go up. But if you say a dvar Torah, then it goes up. So if someone doesn't say a dvar Torah, but at least he says the psukim of shir amalos before the end of the Suda, then all the neshamas go up. So let's hope through our avodah that each and every day of the year that we are given here in Olam Hazeh, we are able to elevate the mundane and turn it into total Kedusha.